Welcome to the Sleepy Scholar, where curious minds drift off to fascinating facts and the world's greatest mysteries. Before you settle in, be sure to like and follow so you can continue to explore the world's most puzzling mysteries and conspiracies on Earth. Tonight, we journey into one of the most legendary places on Earth, a small town in New Mexico, said to sit atop a secret laboratory where humans and something else entirely are said to work side by side, 7 levels beneath the desert floor. This is Dulce Base. So settle in, relax, and let your curiosity drift into the dark. This is the Sleepy Scholar. Dulce is a real, small town in Rio Arriba County, New Mexico, with a population under 3,000, serving as the seat of government for the Jicarilla Apache Nation, whose reservation surrounds it. It sits near the Colorado border, in high desert country dominated by a flat-topped volcanic formation called Archuleta Mesa, straddling the state line. None of that geography is in dispute. What's claimed to lie beneath that mesa is an entirely different matter, a purported multi-level underground facility, sometimes described as 7 stories deep, where advanced human technology, and according to the most extreme versions of the story, non-human beings are said to conduct joint research, including experiments on human and animal subjects. No government agency has ever acknowledged any such facility exists. No photograph, document, or physical evidence has ever been independently authenticated to confirm it. And yet the legend has grown, over nearly 5 decades, into one of the most detailed and widely circulated base mythologies in the entire conspiracy genre, arguably second only to Area 51 in its cultural staying power. The story's roots trace back to the 1970s, a period when Dulce and the surrounding region became associated with a wave of unexplained cattle mutilations. Livestock found dead with precise, unusual incisions and organs removed, sightings that occurred across a broad swath of the American West during that decade, and that remain, to this day, genuinely disputed in their explanation. A local sheriff's deputy investigating some of these incidents reportedly also observed unusual aerial lights and discovered military-style gas masks discarded near affected sites, details that fed early local rumors of covert government involvement in whatever was killing the animals. None of this, on its own, described an underground base of any kind. That specific claim arrived a few years later, and its origin is unusually well documented. Not because the base itself was ever confirmed, but because the man most responsible for popularizing it became the subject of a real, acknowledged government disinformation campaign. That man was Paul Bennewitz, an Albuquerque physicist and successful business owner who ran a company manufacturing precision instruments for clients including NASA and the U.S. Air Force, with his lab situated close enough to Kirtland Air Force Base that he could, by some accounts, nearly shake hands with the guards on base from his own property line. Beginning in 1978, Bennewitz began monitoring radio frequencies near Kirtland and Sandia National Laboratories and became convinced he was intercepting communications from extraterrestrial spacecraft, along with photographing unusual lights he believed were UFOs operating near the base's Manzano weapons storage area. He wrote to television stations, newspapers, senators, and eventually the White House itself, attempting to raise the alarm. What happened next is the part of this story that isn't actually disputed, because it has since been documented in declassified records, journalistic investigation, and public admissions from the people directly involved. Rather than simply dismissing Bennewitz, agents from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, AFOSI, working alongside a UFO researcher and writer named William Moore, who had previously co-authored an early, influential book on the Roswell incident, ran what amounted to a deliberate psychological operation against him. AFOSI agent Richard Doty and Moore fed Bennewitz a steady stream of fabricated documents, including papers describing a fictitious Project Aquarius, and according to later research, staged physical evidence such as air vents on Archuleta Mesa specifically designed to look like the entrance to a secret underground facility. Moore publicly admitted his role in this operation at a UFO research conference in 1989. The apparent motive, according to researcher Greg Bishop's extensively documented 2005 book on the affair, was to redirect Bennewitz's attention away from genuinely classified activity he had stumbled near, including early stealth aircraft testing, by feeding his existing belief in extraterrestrial contact rather than simply denying it outright, calculating that an even stranger, more elaborate alien narrative would discredit him more effectively than a flat denial ever could. It worked, in the sense that it thoroughly discredited him, but at a genuinely devastating human cost. Bennewitz's mental health declined severely over the following years. By 1987, an acquaintance who encountered him described him as looking like he'd lost a dramatic amount of weight, and by most accounts he grew increasingly paranoid, isolated, and fearful, at one point barricading his own home. He was eventually hospitalized for what's been described as a psychiatric crisis. He died in 2003. It's worth pausing on this plainly, out of respect for what actually happened to a real person. A government agency deliberately manufactured false evidence of an alien base specifically to exploit and manipulate a private citizen already struggling with his beliefs, and that manipulation appears to have contributed directly to a serious mental health breakdown from which he never fully recovered. Whatever else this story becomes across the rest of tonight's episode, it's worth remembering that its very first chapter is a story about real, documented government deception causing real harm. Just not the kind of harm, or the kind of secret, that the legend itself eventually claimed. If Paul Bennewitz supplied the legend's foundation, largely without meaning to, the man who gave it its most vivid, most frequently repeated detail arrived more than a decade later, and did so entirely on purpose. Beginning in 1994, a geologist and self-described former government structural engineer named Philip Schneider began touring the UFO lecture circuit, delivering more than 30 talks over roughly 2 years, describing what he said was a 17-year career helping design and excavate deep underground military bases across the United States. Facilities researchers in this genre commonly refer to by the acronym DUMS. Schneider claimed to hold a security clearance he called Rhyolite 38, and said that in 1979, during excavation work at Dulce, his team unexpectedly broke into a large cavern already occupied by extraterrestrial beings he described as Greys. According to his account, a violent confrontation followed. A firefight between the excavation crew, backup military personnel, and the beings themselves, in which he claimed roughly 60 humans were killed, and in which he personally killed 2 of the beings before being struck by some form of directed energy weapon that cost him several fingers and part of his chest. He said he was one of only 3 human survivors. None of this account has ever been independently corroborated by any other named witness, any documentary record, or any physical evidence Schneider was ever willing or able to produce, including the entrance to the facility itself. Schneider continued lecturing even after disclosing that he was dying. He attributed a blood disorder, aplastic anemia, to radiation exposure from the alleged 1979 encounter, and repeatedly told audiences and acquaintances that he expected to be killed for what he was revealing. In January 1996, he was found dead in his apartment in Wilsonville, Oregon, apparently after having been deceased for several days. The official determination, following medical examination, was suicide. His family and supporters have disputed that finding ever since, citing the absence of a suicide note, his repeated public statements anticipating violence against him, and reports that materials from his lectures had gone missing from his home. It's worth stating plainly, out of basic respect for a real person's death. The official cause of death was ruled suicide by the medical examiner's office with jurisdiction over the case, a conclusion that remains contested by people who knew him, and no new evidence has emerged in the intervening decades to formally overturn that ruling. A second key figure in the legend's development, and one whose very existence remains genuinely disputed even within UFO research circles, is a man named Thomas Edwin Costello, said to have worked as a security technician and photographer inside the Dulce facility before turning whistleblower around 1987 and fleeing with what became known as the Dulce Papers. reportedly a set of technical documents, more than 24 black and white photographs, and a short videotape purportedly depicting conditions inside the base. According to the mythology built around him, Costello described 18,000 gray aliens living across 7 distinct underground levels, each supposedly assigned its own function, ranging from human and animal housing on upper levels down to genetics laboratories, and on the lowest and most disturbing level, facilities for what the mythology describes as human-animal hybridization experiments. Some of the associated photographs have circulated online for years captioned as genuine leaked evidence, including one especially widely shared image purporting to show human forms suspended in fluid-filled containment tanks. Independent researchers have since traced that specific photograph directly to a still frame from the 2000 science fiction film The Sixth Day, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, confirming it as a straightforward hoax rather than genuine leaked material of any kind. Costello's own existence has fared little better under scrutiny. No U.S. military personnel record has ever surfaced confirming a Thomas Costello serving in the roles or timeframe his story describes, and researchers investigating the character's origin have traced much of the Costello material back to a woman named in West, whose account, according to at least one detailed investigative retelling, appears to have drawn heavily on earlier, unrelated writing from a man associated with a 1970s Hollow Earth-themed newsletter, meaning the single most detailed eyewitness account of Dulce Base's interior may not trace back to any actual base employee at all, but to a layered chain of secondhand storytelling, each link added by someone with no verified connection to Dulce, Archuleta Mesa, or any government facility whatsoever. None of this uncertainty stopped the story from spreading rapidly through the UFO research community of the late 1980s and 1990s, and one figure in particular deserves mention for his role in amplifying it to a wider audience. John Lear, a commercial pilot who had set numerous real, verified aviation world records over his career, and who, entirely separately from his genuine flying credentials, became one of the most prominent public promoters of the Dulce mythology, incorporating Bennewitz's claims, Schneider's lectures, and the Costello material into a broader, evolving narrative he presented at conferences and in interviews throughout this period, helping weld several previously separate, individually uncorroborated stories into the single, unified Dulce Base legend most people encounter today. It's worth pausing on what the actual community living closest to this legend has to say about it, because the real answer is more layered than either true believers or total hoax fully captures. The Jicarilla Apache Nation, whose reservation land includes Archuleta Mesa itself, has never officially corroborated the existence of any underground base, joint facility, or alien presence beneath their land. Tribal members interviewed by regional newspapers have generally reported nothing more unusual than occasional military helicopter traffic and a persistent stream of outside visitors trespassing in search of aliens. At the same time, individual community members have shared their own sincere, personal accounts over the years. A Jicarilla elder named Jerry Julian, for instance, has publicly described a detailed 1986 encounter near the mesa involving a bright, domed light, a stalled truck engine, and small beings she said approached her later that night. An account she has told consistently, and that deserves to be treated as her own genuine, personal testimony, distinct from the manufactured mythology built by outside promoters like Schneider and the Costello character. And in a place with genuinely limited economic opportunity, tribal leadership has made a pragmatic choice to lean into the legend's tourism potential rather than fight it. Jicarilla Apache Legislative Council President Ty Viceni publicly welcomed visitors to a Dulce Base UFO conference held at the tribally owned Casino Hotel in 2016. And Archuleta Mesa has since picked up the informal nickname Alien Mountain among enthusiasts who make the trip. It's a pattern this series has now seen repeat itself in Nevada, in Bermuda, and now in northern New Mexico. A legend that a struggling local economy has learned it can't uproot and has instead decided to welcome. What actually exists beneath that ground, geologically speaking, is considerably less exotic than the legend, but not nothing. Archuleta Mesa is volcanic in origin, and its rock does contain genuine natural cave systems and underground cavities, a straightforward consequence of the region's geology rather than anything constructed. Kirtland Air Force Base and Los Alamos National Laboratory, both real facilities with real histories of classified Cold War-era research, sit within roughly 100 miles of the town, which some researchers point to as a plausible, mundane source for at least some of the low-flying aircraft, unusual lights, and military helicopter traffic residents have reported over the decades. Proximity to genuine classified defense infrastructure. In other words, doing here roughly the same explanatory work that Nellis Air Force Base's Red Flag exercises did for parts of the Area 51 legend earlier in this series. The mythology itself hasn't even settled on a single, consistent origin story, which is itself worth noting as a sign of how loosely constructed this particular legend really is. One version, associated mainly with Bennewitz's original claims and later promoters, holds that the facility was deliberately designed and built as a genuine joint research operation between human and extraterrestrial parties, established sometime in the mid-20th century as part of a broader technology exchange arrangement. A second, entirely different version claims the U.S. government was actually attempting a 1967 underground nuclear detonation intended to stimulate natural gas reservoirs, a real category of Cold War-era experimental technique, though no verified nuclear test is documented as having occurred at this specific location, and that the blast accidentally breached a naturally occurring cavern system already inhabited by non-human beings, leading to first contact and an eventual negotiated arrangement rather than a planned facility at all. Both versions ultimately arrive at the same claimed outcome, a lasting human-alien partnership beneath the mesa. But they can't both be true as stated, and proponents of the legend have never fully reconciled which founding story is actually supposed to be correct, a level of internal inconsistency that would be considered a serious credibility problem for any conventional historical claim. It's worth grounding all of this against a real, genuinely declassified example of what an actual deep underground military facility looks like for comparison. Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado is a real hardened underground installation built into solid granite, originally constructed in the 1960s to house North American Aerospace Defense Command operations safely below ground in the event of nuclear war, and its existence, general layout, and purpose have been publicly acknowledged by the government for decades, with tours and detailed unclassified descriptions available to the public. Some of the black and white photographs promoted as leaked Dulce Papers images have, in fact, been suggested by researchers to actually depict Cheyenne Mountain's real, unclassified interior, repurposed and recaptioned as supposed evidence of the entirely different, entirely unconfirmed New Mexico facility. It's a useful, concrete illustration of a pattern that runs through nearly every legend this series has covered. Take one real, acknowledged government facility, and watch how easily its genuine photographs can be recycled as evidence for an entirely separate, unverified claim happening somewhere else. One of the strangest threads to attach itself to the Dulce legend traces back to a source that has nothing to do with government secrecy at all: pulp fiction. In August 1929, the magazine Weird Tales published a short story called The Shadow Kingdom by Robert E. Howard, the same author who would later create Conan the Barbarian, featuring a hidden race of serpent people capable of disguising themselves as humans to secretly rule an ancient empire. Researchers who study conspiracy theory history, including political scientist Michael Barkin, have traced a documented chain of influence running from that single piece of 1929 fiction, through a mid-century body of Hollow Earth, pulp writing, and fan newsletters, into the Shaver mystery, a related strand of 1940s science fiction storytelling about degenerate underground races, and from there directly into the Dulce Base mythology as it developed in the late 1980s, with its own descriptions of reptilian beings said to occupy the base's lower levels alongside the Greys. That thread reached its widest audience through a British former sports broadcaster named David Icke, who in 1998 and 1999 published a series of books, beginning with The Biggest Secret, alleging that a secret bloodline of shape-shifting reptilian beings, which he associated with figures including world leaders and members of the British royal family, has covertly controlled human civilization for millennia. Religious studies scholars who've traced Icke's own sourcing have identified his reptilian framework as an amalgamation of several earlier unrelated strands. Zecharia Sitchin's popular but scientifically unsupported Ancient Astronaut, writing about a race called the Anunnaki, testimony from a South African traditional healer named Credo Mutwa, and filtering in through intermediate researchers and writers, elements of the same underground base mythology that had already taken shape around Dulce years earlier. It's worth noting plainly, because credible scholars in this space have raised it directly. Several academics who study conspiracy theories, including Barkin, have observed that the reptilian elite framework structurally echoes much older anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes about secret bloodlines covertly controlling world events, a serious point of scholarly concern about this particular strand of the mythology, regardless of what any individual promoter has intended by it. None of this amounts to scientific plausibility, and it's worth saying so directly rather than leaving it implied. Reptiles and mammals diverged along entirely separate evolutionary paths more than 300 million years ago, a divergence documented extensively in the fossil record, making the convergent re-evolution of an intelligent, human-like reptilian species an evolutionary near impossibility on its own terms. And the additional claim of at-will shapeshifting between reptilian and human form runs directly against basic, well-established physics, since it would require matter to simply appear and disappear from a body in direct violation of the conservation of mass. These aren't minor technical objections. They're the same kind of fundamental scientific barrier that made hollow Earth theorizing, discussed earlier in this series, equally implausible on its own terms. The Dulce legend has continued finding new life well into the current decade, often riding alongside completely separate, far more credible developments in the broader UAP conversation this series has already examined in its Area 51 episode. Following the widely covered 2023 congressional testimony of David Grush, testimony that, as covered earlier in this series, the Pentagon's own ARO office subsequently stated it found no verifiable evidence to support. Online commentators and podcast hosts have repeatedly drawn informal parallels between Grush's claims of recovered non-human craft and the decades-old Dulce mythology, treating the older, entirely uncorroborated Schneider and Costello material as if it somehow lends credibility to the newer testimony, or vice versa, despite the two having no documented connection to each other at all. Media researchers who study how conspiracy content circulates online have noted that short-form video platforms in particular tend to blend these separate stories together indiscriminately, presenting decades-old, never-verified lecture circuit claims alongside recent congressional testimony as though they belong to the same continuous body of evidence, when in fact one involves sworn statements made under oath before Congress and reviewed by a federal office, and the other involves uncorroborated 1990s lecture tours by a man whose own death investigation remains disputed by his family. Not every serious investigator drawn to this story has been content to simply repeat Schneider's lecture tapes or Costello's disputed photographs. A researcher named Norio Hayakawa, who has studied UFO phenomena continuously since 1961 and founded a watchdog organization called the Civilian Intelligence Network in 1990, has spent more than 3 decades specifically investigating Dulce firsthand, including organizing the town's first-ever public conference on the subject, titled The Dulce Base, Fact or Fiction? In March 2009. Hayakawa's conclusion, after all that fieldwork, is direct. He states plainly that he does not believe a physical underground base exists beneath Archuleta Mesa. At the same time, he's been careful not to dismiss every account he's encountered, noting that he personally hasn't witnessed anything unusual in Dulce, but adding that his visits have mostly been during daylight hours, and that he can't disprove the sincere, first-hand experiences other residents have described to him, since he wasn't present to witness them himself. Hayakawa has also proposed a specific theory for why the legend has been allowed to persist so freely. He suggests that associating a real, sensitive research or testing location with UFO rumors, creating what he calls a laughter curtain, can function as a deliberate or incidental way of discouraging serious journalistic or public scrutiny, since ridicule tends to do a more effective job of deflecting attention than official denial ever does, a theory he's applied to both Dulce and, in his separate decade of research, to Area 51 in Nevada. The cattle mutilations that helped ignite the entire legend in the first place have their own dedicated, real investigator. Gabe Valdez, a New Mexico State police officer, spent years personally investigating mutilation cases in and around Dulce during the 1970s, and his son later compiled his father's original case files into a 2013 book examining what Valdez had actually documented on the ground. Valdez's own investigations remained genuinely open to unconventional explanations, including government involvement of some kind, and he became one of the earliest, most credible voices lending real law enforcement weight to the idea that something organized, rather than simply random predation, might be behind at least some of the incidents, a perspective that helped give the broader legend an unusual degree of local credibility precisely because it came from a working police officer rather than a lecture circuit promoter. It's worth setting Valdez's genuine on-the-ground concern next to what more recent, dedicated forensic and veterinary research has actually found. The FBI itself opened a formal inquiry into the phenomenon, sometimes referred to as Operation Animal Mutilation, running from 1979 into 1980, and its files, since released under public records requests, concluded that the overwhelming majority of cases were consistent with natural predation and decomposition, misread by investigators and ranchers unfamiliar with exactly how scavenging animals behave on a fresh carcass. Veterinary pathologists who've studied the phenomenon in detail since, including a 1992 review in the Canadian Veterinary Journal examining more than 200 cases in Western Canada, describe a specific, well-documented sequence. Blowflies lay eggs in an animal's natural orifices within hours of death, and the resulting larvae burrow into and liquefy soft tissue, often exiting through what looks like a precise surgical opening, but is actually the path of least resistance for a maggot working through the softest, most moisture-rich tissue available. The eyes, lips, tongue, udder, and genitals in that order of preference, which happens to match almost exactly the list of missing parts most frequently cited in mutilation reports. Coyotes and other mammalian scavengers, feeding at these same soft points afterward, tend to bite and pull back rather than tear continuously, producing a straight-edged wound that untrained observers frequently describe as looking laser-cut or surgical, even though it's an entirely ordinary predation pattern. And the widely cited absence of blood is explained by simple postmortem physiology. Once an animal's heart stops, blood settles downward under gravity and coagulates internally, a process called livor mortis, rather than draining externally, meaning a carcass can appear to have been deliberately, surgically drained of blood, when in fact the blood never left the body at all. One researcher who has personally investigated roughly 200 mutilation cases has noted that even with all of this scientific explanation in hand, somewhere around 20% of cases he examined struck him as genuinely unusual enough to resist easy explanation. Not proof of anything extraordinary, but an honest acknowledgement that a small residual percentage of cases still don't fit the pattern as cleanly as the majority do. One name has quietly threaded through nearly every part of this story so far, and it's worth giving him his own full accounting, because his career didn't end when Paul Bennewitz's did. Richard Doty spent 20 years with the Air Force, including a significant stretch as a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations at Kirtland Air Force Base. And he has since publicly admitted, in his own words and on camera, to running an extensive, deliberate disinformation campaign against UFO researchers throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, forging documents, altering details specifically to redirect attention away from genuinely classified programs, and feeding fabricated material to exactly the kind of researchers who would go on to spread it as though it were leaked truth. Beyond his direct role in the Bennewitz affair, Doty has been identified by multiple independent UFO researchers, including Robert Hastings, as the individual behind the codename Falcon, used as a key source for the so-called Majestic 12 or MJ-12 documents that surfaced in the 1980s. A set of papers purporting to reveal a secret committee established to manage government knowledge of and contact with extraterrestrial beings. Researchers who examined these documents closely identified errors and inconsistencies almost immediately, and Doty has since acknowledged, in his own later statements, that operations like this one deliberately blended small amounts of genuine fact with substantial fabrication, precisely to make the resulting material harder to fully dismiss. Years later, he was also connected to a separate, related fabrication known as the Serpo story, which expanded the Alien Treaty narrative into an elaborate tale of an actual interplanetary exchange program between the United States and an alien civilization. A further layer of invented material built on the same foundational technique he'd already used against Bennewitz over a decade earlier. What makes Doty's story different from most other figures in this episode is that his career as a source of these claims never actually stopped, even after his methods became widely known and documented. Rather than fading from the UFO research community once his role in the Bennewitz affair came to light, Doty reinvented himself as a regular, paid presence at UFO conferences, in documentaries, and in podcast interviews, frequently introduced as a former Afosi insider, with genuine secrets still to share. He appeared in the 2013 documentary Mirage Men, the same investigation into government UFO disinformation strategy that this series referenced earlier in its Area 51 episode, where he admitted directly on camera to having planted lies and manipulated researchers, describing his actions without evident remorse. And in more recent interviews and appearances, researchers who've tracked his public statements closely have noted something almost circular. The same core themes he originally fabricated to deceive Bennewitz in the 1980s. Underground bases, government alien treaties, recovered non-human craft, continue showing up in his talks today, except now they're framed not as disinformation he once planted, but as insider knowledge he's finally willing to reveal. The lies that were originally designed to protect classified programs by burying them under a more entertaining false story have, decades later, become their own standalone product, sold to paying audiences who often have no idea they're hearing a recycled version of the very same fabrication that helped destroy Paul Bennewitz's health and reputation in the first place. It's a genuinely fitting, if unsettling, place to have arrived by this point in tonight's episode. The single most influential person in shaping the entire Dulce Base mythology, across the decades this story has been told and retold, was never an alien, a whistleblower, or a secret government scientist. It was a real intelligence officer whose actual documented job for a period of his real career was inventing exactly this kind of story, and who appears to have simply kept doing it on his own initiative long after anyone was paying him to. Not everyone who has spent decades investigating this broader mystery arrived from within the UFO research community itself. Linda Moulton Howe began her career as a legitimate, credentialed mainstream broadcast journalist, a Stanford graduate with a master's degree in communication, who spent the late 1970s producing award-winning documentaries on entirely conventional subjects: air and water pollution, medical research, and environmental policy. Work recognized with a Colorado Public Health Award and multiple regional Emmys at Denver's KMGH-TV. In September 1979, working from that same credentialed journalistic foundation, Howe began investigating reports of cattle found dead across Colorado and soon after, across every U.S. state, every Canadian province, and multiple continents, with the same recurring, unexplained profile discussed earlier in this episode: precise soft tissue removal, no blood, no tracks. Her resulting documentary, A Strange Harvest, aired in May 1980 to the largest local audience in her station's history and earned her a regional Emmy. Though it's worth noting precisely what that specific award recognized. Outstanding achievement in audio and sound design, a technical distinction rather than one for journalistic content or accuracy. Howe went on to conclude, based largely on rancher testimony and claims from anonymous sources she said had shown her classified material, that the mutilations were the work of non-human intelligence, and she has continued producing books and documentaries advancing that view for more than 4 decades since, including a 1989 book, An Alien Harvest, and a long-running investigative website, Earth Files, chronicling thousands of additional reports of anomalous phenomena. It's worth weighing Howe's case carefully and fairly because she genuinely doesn't fit the same profile as Schneider or the disputed Costello character. She holds real academic credentials, a real, verifiable mainstream broadcast career predating any of her UFO-related work, and actual, formally recognized journalism awards, even if the specific 1981 Emmy Award itself recognized technical sound production rather than investigative content. At the same time, critics examining her core claims, including author John Greer, have pointed out directly that Howe has never produced independently verifiable evidence for extraterrestrial involvement beyond the same ambiguous physical evidence this episode already walked through in detail. Decomposing animal carcasses whose condition is thoroughly explainable through ordinary scavenging, bloating, and insect activity, without requiring any non-human explanation at all. Howe's claims of having been shown secret government documents by anonymous, unnamed sources are, by their very nature, impossible to independently verify, following exactly the same evidentiary pattern as Bennewitz's intercepted transmissions, Schneider's undocumented firefight, and Costello's disputed photographs, a credentialed, sincere investigator, working entirely in good faith by her own account, still ultimately relying on sourcing that can't be checked by anyone outside her own reporting. We touched briefly on the majestic 12 documents earlier, in connection with Richard Doty's alleged role as the source codenamed Falcon. But the forensic case against their authenticity deserves its own full accounting, because it's genuinely one of the more thoroughly documented debunkings in this entire genre. The MJ 12 Papers first surfaced in 1984, describing a secret committee supposedly established by executive order under President Truman in September 1947, on the recommendation of scientist Vannevar Bush and Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, tasked with managing the recovery and investigation of crashed alien spacecraft. The forensic problems started almost immediately once researchers began examining the documents closely. Skeptical investigator Philip Klass determined that Truman's signature on the papers was not an original signature at all, but a pasted-on photocopy, reproduced, including its accidental scratch marks, from a completely genuine, unrelated Truman memo actually sent to Vannevar Bush on October 1, 1947. Meaning whoever assembled the forged document had simply lifted a real signature from a real, separate piece of correspondence and grafted it onto fabricated content. Separately, researchers determined that one of the alleged authors of a related memo, Robert Cutler, was verifiably out of the country on the exact date he supposedly wrote it, making his authorship a physical impossibility. Perhaps most damning of all, later analysis of the typewriter font used in a related Truman letter identified it as a specific Smith Corona model that, according to manufacturer records, didn't exist until 1962, 15 years after the document was supposedly typed in 1947, an anachronism no genuine period document could ever produce. The National Archives conducted searches of Project Blue Book and related presidential records, and found nothing corroborating any committee called Majestic 12 in any executive branch record. The FBI opened its own investigation and explicitly labeled the materials completely bogus in its case file and the Government Accountability Office later confirmed that neither federal archivists nor the Air Force could find any documentary evidence tying the papers to genuine executive branch activity. Even Klass, a committed skeptic who assumed for a time that FOSI's disinformation apparatus might be behind the documents, ultimately dismissed that theory too, on the grounds that the forgeries contained flaws so obvious they would never have fooled a genuinely hostile foreign intelligence service. Meaning whoever created them wasn't running a sophisticated state-level operation at all, just producing convincing enough material for a domestic audience already primed to believe it. None of this forensic consensus has fully closed the debate, and it's worth noting honestly why. MJ-12's most persistent defender, researcher Stanton Friedman, argued that Truman was known to use an autopen device for routine signatures, which could theoretically account for identical marks appearing on two separate documents, and he identified other genuine government papers using date formats similar to the disputed ones, directly challenging one of Klass's specific objections. Friedman also pointed out what he considered a stranger, more interesting anomaly. One name on the alleged MJ-12 committee roster was Dr. Donald Menzel, a real Harvard astronomer publicly known for his career actively debunking UFO reports. An inclusion that seemed at first glance like an obvious forger's mistake, until Friedman's research turned up genuine, documented evidence that Menzel had held real, high-level security clearances and government consulting relationships that were not publicly known at the time the documents surfaced, a detail that at minimum complicates any simple, the forger picked a random skeptic's name explanation. None of this rehabilitates the pasted signature or the anachronistic typewriter. But it's worth including as an honest illustration of why this particular controversy, unlike Costello's photographs or Schneider's testimony, still generates genuine, ongoing argument among researchers who don't all fall neatly into true believer or confirmed hoax camps. In 2005, a fresh iteration of this same broader mythology surfaced under an entirely new name, and its provenance turned out to trace back to exactly where a careful listener might expect by this point in tonight's episode. A series of anonymous emails began circulating on a UFO research mailing list, describing something called Project Serpo, a claimed secret exchange program in which 12 American military personnel, 10 men and 2 women, supposedly traveled aboard an alien spacecraft to a planet orbiting a star in the Zeta Reticuli system, beginning in 1965 and lasting roughly 13 years. According to the story, the entire arrangement had been made possible by a surviving alien, referred to as an extraterrestrial biological entity, or EB, recovered following the 1947 Roswell incident and held at Los Alamos National Laboratory until its death in 1952, at which point a follow-up craft arrived to retrieve its remains and finalize terms for the ongoing exchange. The claim details were extensive and specific, faster-than-light travel accomplished in a matter of months, 2 astronauts who reportedly died during the mission, 2 who chose to remain behind permanently, and a small handful of survivors who eventually returned to Earth carrying first-hand accounts of an entirely alien culture, language, and technology. None of it has ever been corroborated by any government record, named on-the-record witness, or independently verifiable document. And its origin turned out to be considerably less mysterious than the story itself. Researchers examining the original anonymous emails traced every one of them to the same IP address, which multiple investigators identified as belonging directly to Richard Doty's own account. The same FOSI officer whose earlier, admitted disinformation campaign against Paul Bennewitz opened this entire episode. Author Jacques Vallée, in his own investigation into related Roswell-era claims, separately documented that Doty, using his Air Force credentials, had approached journalist Linda Moulton how as early as 1983, offering her supposed Air Force records describing a similar alien exchange arrangement in return for her help producing an HBO documentary about it, meaning the Core Exchange Program. Concept Doty later recycled as Serpo in 2005 had already been part of his toolkit more than 2 decades earlier, offered to the very same journalist this episode discussed a little earlier for her cattle mutilation investigations. It's worth sitting with how tightly this connects everything covered across tonight's journey. One man's documented, admitted disinformation career runs directly through Paul Bennewitz's psychological breakdown in the early 1980s, through the MJ-12 forgeries as Falcon, through an approach to Linda Moulton, how offering fabricated exchange program documents that same decade, and 20-plus years later, through the anonymous 2005 emails that became Project Serpo, for seemingly separate UFO mysteries, spanning multiple decades and multiple completely different casts of believers. Tracing back to variations on the same handful of themes, recycled by the same identifiable source, each time presented to a new audience, as though it were being revealed for the very first time. Throughout this episode, Kirtland Air Force Base has come up repeatedly as the real physical location where Paul Bennewitz lived and worked, where Richard Doty was stationed, and where the entire Dulce mythology first took shape. It's worth knowing, before we close, what Kirtland's own real, documented, entirely earthly secrets actually turned out to be, because the base has a genuine history of serious institutional failure. Just not the kind involving aliens. Kirtland houses one of the largest operational nuclear weapons storage facilities in the country, maintained by a unit called the 898th Munitions Squadron, tasked with safeguarding an estimated 2,000 nuclear warheads inside a bunkered underground complex. In January 2008, the Air Force decertified that entire squadron after it failed a routine nuclear surety inspection. The formal process meant to verify that a unit is meeting the strict security and handling standards required for nuclear weapons custody. Air Force spokespeople initially characterized the failures as largely administrative, involving paperwork and documentation problems, but the response suggested something more serious than routine record-keeping. 5 senior non-commissioned officers, the experienced supervisors directly responsible for day-to-day security procedures, were quietly reassigned away from the unit as part of the fallout. And independent nuclear policy analysts who tracked this kind of incident publicly noted that the scale of the response implied problems running considerably deeper than simple paperwork. Kirtland's failure didn't happen in isolation. Just months earlier, in August 2007, an entirely separate and more widely reported incident had already placed the Air Force's nuclear custody procedures under intense national scrutiny. 6 cruise missiles, each fitted with a live nuclear warhead, were mistakenly loaded onto a B-52 bomber at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota and flown, unsecured and unaccounted for by the standard mandatory safeguards, all the way to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, remaining improperly secured for roughly 36 hours before anyone realized what had actually happened. The resulting investigation found systemic breakdowns in training, discipline, and leadership so severe that Defense Secretary Robert Gates took the unprecedented step of removing both the Air Force's civilian secretary and its top uniformed officer simultaneously. The first time in the department's history that both top leaders of a single military service had been forced out together over a single incident. Neither of these episodes has anything whatsoever to do with extraterrestrial contact, underground alien laboratories, or joint human-gray research programs. But they represent something arguably more unsettling, precisely because they're entirely real, extensively documented, and involve the actual, physical safety of live nuclear weapons under the direct custody of the very base at the center of this entire episode's mythology. It's worth holding this alongside everything else covered tonight. The government agency most closely associated with manufacturing an elaborate fictional underground alien conspiracy, specifically to distract public attention, was, during some of these very same years, dealing with genuine, serious, well-documented lapses in handling the most dangerous weapons ever built. A real secret considerably more dangerous than anything Bennewitz, Schneider, or Costello ever claimed to have uncovered. Nearly every thread covered across this entire episode eventually loops back to a single point of origin, so it's worth closing our factual accounting with the actual, documented history of that founding event itself. In early July 1947, a rancher named W. Mack Brazel discovered unusual debris scattered across property. He worked northwest of Roswell, New Mexico, and reported it to the local sheriff, who in turn contacted the Roswell Army Airfield. Major Jesse Marcel, an intelligence officer with the 509th Bombardment Group, was dispatched along with counterintelligence agents Sheridan Cavett and Louis Rickett to examine the material, which they described as thin, light, foil-like fragments, square balsa-style sticks, and rubber remnants, along with a small black box resembling a weather instrument. On July 8, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield's own Public Information Office issued a press release stating plainly that the base had recovered a flying disc. Language that ran the very next day in the Roswell Daily Record under the now-famous headline, RAF Captures Flying Saucer on Ranch in Roswell Region. Within 24 hours, the military completely reversed its own public position, with Brigadier General Roger Ramey announcing that the material had actually been identified as debris from a conventional weather balloon, and photographs were released showing Marcel posing with foil and rubber fragments entirely consistent with that explanation. For more than 3 decades, that weather balloon explanation stood essentially unchallenged in public memory. It began to unravel in 1978, when Marcel, by then retired, was interviewed by researcher Stanton Friedman, the same MJ-12 defender discussed earlier in this episode, and told Friedman that the weather balloon story had actually been a cover, and that he personally believed the material he'd recovered might have been extraterrestrial in origin. That interview effectively relaunched Roswell as a modern conspiracy phenomenon, more than 30 years after the original incident, and helped set the stage for later claims, emerging especially in 1979 and after, describing not just wreckage, but recovered alien bodies at the crash site. The government's actual, documented explanation finally arrived through 2 formal Air Force investigations, in 1994 and 1997. According to that research, the debris Brazel found had come from a then-classified program called Project Mogul, a genuinely real, top-secret Cold War initiative using trains of high-altitude balloons fitted with sensitive microphones, specifically designed to detect the acoustic signature of Soviet nuclear weapons tests from a great distance. Project personnel who were located and interviewed decades later confirmed that several of their own Mogul balloon trains had gone missing in exactly the right place and time frame to account for Brazel's debris, and that the original 1947 press release describing a flying disc had been retracted specifically to avoid revealing the existence of the genuinely classified surveillance program underneath it, meaning the government's own explanation for the cover-up wasn't extraterrestrial secrecy at all, but fairly mundane Cold War operational security, dressed up, ironically, as a still stranger story about crashed alien technology, precisely because that stranger story was considered easier and safer to let stand at the time. As one retired Smithsonian space history curator later put it, a flying saucer was, in a very real sense, an easier thing for the Air Force to publicly admit to in 1947 than the existence of a classified surveillance program monitoring Soviet nuclear activity. The later 1997 investigation into specific claims of recovered alien bodies concluded that those particular accounts traced back to separate, unrelated military tests involving anthropomorphic test dummies, dropped by parachute during the 1950s, whose presence in later, conflated eyewitness memory appears to have been folded backward in time onto the original 1947 incident by witnesses recalling 2 genuinely separate events as though they'd been one and the same. It's worth closing our tour of this genre with the one comparison case where genuine, documented government money actually did flow toward investigating anomalous phenomena, because it stands in useful contrast to nearly everything covered about Dulce tonight. Skinwalker Ranch, a roughly 512-acre property in Uintah County, Utah, takes its name from Navajo skinwalker folklore and has carried a reputation for strange phenomena. Unexplained lights, cattle disappearances, and equipment malfunctions, reported by its owners for decades, beginning well before its more recent fame. Aerospace entrepreneur Robert Bigelow purchased the property in 1996, specifically to study these claims through his own organization, the National Institute for Discovery Science, and the ranch's reputation might have stayed a regional curiosity if not for what happened over a decade later. In 2007, a Defense Intelligence Agency scientist named James Lakatsky read a book about the ranch's history, visited the property personally, reported having his own unusual experience there, and brought the matter to the attention of Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, a longtime friend of Bigelow's. That connection led directly to the creation of a real, federally funded Pentagon initiative called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, or OSAP, which operated from roughly 2007 to 2012 with approximately $22 million in funding, awarded specifically to Bigelow's own contracting firm, Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies. Some of that program's fieldwork took place directly at Skinwalker Ranch alongside broader research into aerospace threats and unidentified aerial phenomena more generally. The entire program remained secret until December 2017, when New York Times journalists Helene Cooper, Ralph Blumenthal, and Leslie Kean published an investigation revealing its existence, its funding, and its direct connection to the ranch. A story that helped lay groundwork for the same broader UAP disclosure conversation this series has already traced through ADIP and, eventually, into congressional hearings and David Grush's testimony in its Area 51 episode. Bigelow sold the ranch in 2016 for roughly $500,000 to a buyer whose identity remained secret for several years, eventually revealed to be Brandon Fugel, a Utah commercial real estate executive who has since become the public face of ongoing investigation there, serving as executive producer and on-camera participant in 2 History Channel series documenting the property. Fugel has said publicly that Bigelow's stated reason for selling wasn't financial at all, but personal discomfort with continuing to be associated with a Pentagon-funded program he preferred to keep private, an account Bigelow reportedly confirmed separately in his own interview. Fugel has assembled his own modern research team, including astrophysicist Travis Taylor and other credentialed investigators, continuing controlled scientific study of the property, while, notably, engaging with public media far more openly than Bigelow ever did. It's worth being precise about what this comparison actually establishes, and what it doesn't. Unlike Dulce, the Pentagon's financial and institutional involvement with Skinwalker Ranch is a documented, confirmed fact, verified through FOIA releases, named officials on the record, and independent investigative journalism, not an anonymous lecture circuit claim or a disputed photograph. What it does not establish is that anything genuinely extraordinary was actually found there. Even sympathetic recent accounts of the ranch's history are careful to note that the government funding demonstrates institutional curiosity and willingness to investigate, not confirmation of anomalous phenomena. The witnesses involved, including NIDS staff and the ranch's prior owning family, appear to have been sincere in their reports, but sincerity, as this entire episode has demonstrated repeatedly, has never been the same thing as independently verified evidence. Having spent this much of tonight's episode establishing what's actually confirmed, what's disputed, and what's been outright debunked, it's worth spending some time simply laying out the legend itself in full, the way it's actually told across decades of retellings. Because the internal detail of the story, whatever its evidentiary status, is a genuinely elaborate piece of collective storytelling in its own right. According to the version most commonly repeated, drawing primarily from the Costello material, the facility beneath Archuleta Mesa spans 7 distinct levels, each with its own designated purpose. The uppermost level is described as a security and human staff housing area, relatively ordinary in appearance, meant to make new arrivals feel as though they'd simply taken an unusual government job rather than entered anything more disturbing. The second level reportedly houses more advanced electronics, computer systems, and standard laboratory research space. The third level, according to the legend, is dedicated to human resource operations, record-keeping and personnel management for the facility's workforce. Descending further, the fourth level is where the story turns considerably darker. This is described as a security and detention area, sometimes referred to as a brain scrub section, allegedly used to erase or alter the memories of individuals who had seen too much, including, in the most extreme retellings, some of the humans reported missing from Dulce and the surrounding region over the decades. The fifth level, in the legend's telling, is entirely given over to what's described as advanced genetic engineering and cloning research. The sixth level is where the mythology's most viscerally disturbing claims concentrate. Described as a space containing human, animal, and hybrid specimens held in various stages of experimentation, including the fluid-filled containment tanks depicted in the photograph, this episode already traced back to a hoaxed still from a 2000 science fiction film. And the seventh, deepest level is described, in Costello's own alleged testimony, in the starkest terms of all: rows of cold storage containing what the material describes as thousands of human and human mixture remains. The mythology further claims the facility was, at its height, home to roughly 18,000 gray aliens, alongside a smaller, more feared population of reptilian beings said to occupy the very lowest levels and hold a kind of authority over the Greys themselves. A detail that connects this specific legend directly to the broader reptilian mythology traced earlier in this episode back through David Icke to 1929 pulp fiction. Believers describe a rigid, compartmentalized security culture inside the facility, in which human staff were reportedly warned, upon arrival, that the human test subjects were hopelessly insane, and that discussing the base's true nature with anyone outside their specific clearance level carried the threat of severe punishment, including death. None of this, not the level count, not the population figures, not the specific function assigned to any individual floor, has ever been documented in any verifiable government record, satellite survey, geological study, or independently corroborated eyewitness account beyond the disputed testimony already examined earlier in this episode. It exists entirely within a closed loop of retellings, originating substantially from a single disputed source whose own existence remains in question, amplified by decades of lecture circuits, radio programs, and now short-form video content, each new telling adding its own small embellishments to a structure that was never verified in the first place. And yet the sheer internal consistency and detail of the story, the specific level numbers, the specific alleged population figures, the specific chain of command, is itself part of why this particular legend has endured as long as it has, succeeding, in narrative terms, for exactly the same reason a well-constructed piece of fiction succeeds. Not because it's true, but because it's told with enough specific, confident detail to feel like it could be. The Dulce legend's claims about genetic engineering and human-alien hybridization didn't emerge in a vacuum. Either, they draw on a much older, separately established body of pseudo-historical theorizing worth understanding on its own terms. Beginning with his 1968 bestseller Chariots of the Gods, Swiss author Erich von Däniken popularized what's now called the ancient astronaut theory. The claim that extraterrestrial visitors shaped early human civilization, pointing to monuments like the Egyptian pyramids, Peru's Nazca lines, and various ancient artworks as supposed evidence of technology beyond what ancient peoples could have developed on their own. The book became an enormous commercial success and spawned multiple television documentaries, but it also drew sustained scholarly criticism. Historians and archaeologists reviewing his specific claims, including in a critical 1978 Nova documentary, found that von Däniken had repeatedly misrepresented or outright fabricated details of the archaeological record to fit his thesis, rather than working from it honestly. A more elaborate and even more directly relevant version of this theorizing came from Zecharia Sitchin, whose Earth Chronicles book series, beginning with the 12th planet in 1976, proposed that Sumerian texts described a race of extraterrestrial beings called the Anunnaki, who supposedly traveled from an undiscovered planet Sitchin called Nibiru roughly 450,000 years ago. seeking to mine gold and other raw materials. According to Sitchin's account, the Anunnaki genetically engineered early hominids specifically to serve as a slave labor force, eventually producing modern Homo sapiens as the result. Scholars specializing in actual Sumerian language and literature have thoroughly rejected this reading, noting directly that the Anunnaki, as they genuinely appear in surviving cuneiform texts, are never depicted as alien visitors of any kind, and that Sitchin's specific translations of key terms don't match how those same terms are understood by mainstream Assyriologists working from the same original source material, with one detailed academic rebuttal noting that anyone can check the primary texts for themselves through publicly available digital archives of Sumerian literature. Modern astronomy, for its part, has found no evidence whatsoever supporting the existence of Nibiru as Sitchin described it. The connection to tonight's central subject is direct rather than coincidental. As covered earlier in this episode, a researcher named Arthur David Horn published a 1994 book explicitly fusing Sitchin's Anunnaki framework with the reptilian material already circulating out of the Dulce mythology, and that fusion fed directly into David Icke's own later, even more widely popularized reptilian elite theorizing. The genetic engineering and hybridization claims attributed to Dulce's lower levels. The idea of an advanced species deliberately manipulating human genetics for its own purposes echo Sitchin's Anunnaki narrative closely enough that several researchers who trace this mythology's development treat the two as functionally the same underlying story, simply relocated from ancient Mesopotamia to a modern underground facility in New Mexico and rebranded from ancient gods to gray aliens along the way. It's a pattern that should feel familiar by the end of this episode. Separate, individually unverified narratives, drawn from entirely different eras and different source material, repeatedly merging together into whichever single larger story happens to be culturally dominant at a given moment. Sumerian mythology feeding ancient astronaut theory feeding reptilian conspiracy theory, and reptilian conspiracy theory feeding directly into the specific genetic experimentation claims that make up some of the most disturbing details of the Dulce legend as it's told today. Every account covered across this episode, Bennewitz's transmissions, Schneider's firefight, Costello's photographs, describes the same basic type of alien being. Small, gray-skinned, with an oversized head and large, dark eyes. It's worth knowing where that specific, now universal image actually entered popular culture, because it traces back to a single, well-documented case that predates Dulce by nearly 2 decades. On the night of September 19, 1961, Betty and Barney Hill, a married couple driving home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, from a vacation in Canada, reported watching an unusual light in the sky follow their car through the White Mountains for an extended period. They arrived home later than the drive should have taken, unable to account for roughly 2 hours of missing time, and noticed their watches had stopped working and their clothing showed unusual damage. Disturbed by recurring nightmares in the following months, the couple eventually sought help from Dr. Benjamin Simon, a Boston psychiatrist specializing in hypnosis, then a mainstream and widely respected clinical technique. Beginning in January 1964, Simon conducted separate weekly hypnotic regression sessions with each of them over roughly 7 months, all recorded on tape. Under hypnosis, both Betty and Barney described being taken aboard a craft and examined by humanoid beings roughly 5 feet tall, with gray skin, pear-shaped heads, and large, slanted eyes. The very first detailed description in UFO folklore of what would become known as Greys. Betty's account, published in the 1966 book The Interrupted Journey, included details like a needle inserted near her navel described as a pregnancy test, and a conversation with a being she described as a leader, who showed her a star map. It's worth knowing what came out of that story almost immediately, because it bears directly on how seriously to weigh testimony recovered this way. Skeptical researchers later pointed out that an episode of the television series The Outer Limits, featuring an alien with strikingly similar slanted eyes, had aired only a few weeks before the Hills' reported encounter, raising a real documented question about whether the specific visual details recalled under hypnosis months later might have been influenced by recent television viewing rather than an independent memory of an actual event. More broadly, modern research on hypnosis has repeatedly demonstrated that the technique can encourage confabulation, the sincere creation of detailed, vivid false memories, particularly in people who are highly suggestible or being guided by a questioner's expectations. A finding directly relevant given that nearly every subsequent alien abduction account, including many connected loosely to the broader Dulce mythology, has relied on the same basic method, a troubling but vague initial experience, followed by increasingly specific, detailed recall recovered only through hypnotic regression sessions conducted afterward. This single 1961 case, more than any single document or lecture connected directly to Dulce, effectively established the visual and narrative template that every subsequent account in this genre has drawn from ever since. The small gray being, the examination table, the star map, the missing time, the memory recovered only under hypnosis. Whatever actually happened to Betty and Barney Hill that night in the White Mountains, the shape of their story became the shape of the entire genre that followed it, including 6 decades later, the specific beings described populating the 7 levels beneath Archuleta Mesa. We've walked a long way beneath this one small mesa tonight. Let's gather the full shape of it before we close. We began with Paul Bennewitz, a real physicist whose life was genuinely, deliberately destroyed by a documented Air Force disinformation campaign. Not to hide aliens, but to hide classified stealth aircraft testing, using an invented alien story as cover. We followed that same thread through Richard Doty's entire career, from his admitted role feeding Bennewitz forged documents, through his identity as Falcon behind the debunked Dulce Papers, through his 1983 approach to journalist Linda Moulton Howe, and into the 2005 Project Serpo emails traced directly back to his own IP address. One man's recycled toolkit, reused across 4 decades and at least 3 separate, supposedly independent UFO mysteries. We examined Phil Schneider's uncorroborated firefight and his disputed death, and Thomas Costello's photographs and disputed existence, including one image definitively traced to a Hollywood film. We gave the Jicarilla Apache Nation's own real, nuanced relationship to this legend the respect it deserves, neither confirming nor mocking it, simply living alongside it, and in recent years, choosing to welcome the tourism it brings. We traced the actual science behind the cattle mutilations that started it all, down to the specific order in which blowflies and coyotes feed on a carcass. We followed the reptilian mythology back through David Icke to a 1929 pulp fiction story, and the genetic engineering claims back through Zecharia Sitchin's disputed Sumerian translations. We found the real, documented 2008 nuclear security failure at Kirtland, a genuine secret, considerably more dangerous than anything the legend ever invented. We walked through the actual, declassified history of Roswell, and the real Pentagon money that once flowed toward Skinwalker Ranch. And we traced the entire visual template of the gray alien back to one hypnotized couple in New Hampshire in 1961, recorded on tape, 6 years before Dulce's own legend even began. What emerges from all of it isn't really a story about a secret base at all. It's a story about how a handful of real, human ingredients, a troubled man, a government willing to lie to protect its secrets, a psychiatrist's hypnosis sessions, pulp fiction from 1929, mistranslated Sumerian tablets, and one intelligence officer who never really stopped telling the same story to new audiences, can combine over decades into something that feels, from the outside, like a single unified mystery. It isn't. It's dozens of separate threads, most of them fully traceable, most of them fully explicable, woven together by believers, storytellers, and at least one professional disinformation officer, into a 7-level structure that has never once been confirmed to physically exist. And yet, somewhere beneath that mesa, or nowhere at all, the story keeps going anyway. New emails, new podcasts, new congressional hearings drawing informal comparisons to a mythology 40 years its senior. Whatever the truth is, the legend itself has clearly earned its own kind of permanence. There are other fences, other mesas, other quiet edges of the map, waiting for other nights. We've already walked the coast of the Bermuda Triangle and the wilderness of the Alaska Triangle earlier in this series. Somewhere ahead, we'll spend a night with the biggest question of all. Not just one underground base, but the far larger question of whether anyone else is out there in the universe at all, and what it would actually take, scientifically, to ever know for certain. You don't have to remember any of it tonight. That's what tomorrow night is for. This has been the Sleepy Scholar. Sleep well.